Modeling COVID-19 and Household Mobility by Yoshi, Denis, Hudon, Mitchell Joseph, and Erik Weis. Since 2019, the COVID-19 pandemic has raised awareness globally of the individual and community-level public health measures necessary to minimize infectious disease transmission. Our team was interested in how COVID changed the way we think about where we live, what factors drive household mobility, and how the pandemic may change the structure of American communities. Many factors affect a household's decision to move or where a family might look to relocate. In 2020, widespread unemployment and federal and state eviction moratoria made resources and housing scarce, but those with the opportunity to work remotely could consider for the first time living in another community. Preferences for population density among some households undoubtedly also changed. We wanted to select just a few of the factors to model household mobility prior to the advent of COVID-19, then observe how changes in the way people made decisions changed the way households moved. Did changes to household movement also affect the structure of communities and the flow between them? We used an agent-based modeling approach with 3 primary objects. Agents were coded with invariant identifiers so that we could track their movement over time. Their income, job status, and preferences about a location's population density were all attributes that factored into their move decisions. Locations, similarly, had both invariant and variable attributes. A location's capacity, or maximum population, was set upon initialization and remained constant for the duration of a simulation, as did a randomly generated quality or desirability index. Median income, housing cost, and population density were all quantities that we calculated based on the aggregation of agents within a location at a given point in time, as well as those agents' characteristics. Finally, the simulation environment was comprised of an M by M matrix of locations and agents, all initialized according to different distributions of income, population capacity, etc. The simulation environment stored information about the location of agents and the resulting attributes of its locations at every time step and kept track of trends resulting from the introduction of COVID. In order to calculate a household's probability of moving, we first aggregated a set of subscores relating different factors in the decision-making process to a higher or lower probability of moving. Here, you can see visualizations of assumptions underlying 2 of the subscores we used, assumptions that were relevant to the relationship of income to housing insecurity. First, we assumed that for most Americans, a household would be less likely to move if their income approximated the location median income where they currently lived. While we didn't want to force an outcome of scarce income heterogeneity, we did want to capture the reality that most households won't live wildly above or below their means, so we created a biased random process to calculate a subscore such that a household would be more likely to move at either extreme of the household income to median income ratio. We also knew that very low income and no income households were by nature more sensitive to housing cost, income changes, and unexpected expenses, and more likely to be forced by circumstance into transiency or homelessness. So we tried to capture a dynamic where, among low and middle income households, the change in move probability became exponentially steeper as income approached 0. Finally, we took these and other subscores calculated by a simulation, normalized and aggregated them, then used a nonlinear transformation function to derive a single likely-to-move score for each agent at a given time step. The most complex mechanisms we developed governed our agents' decisions to move. Movement probability was modeled as a function of the relationship between a location's housing cost and a household's income. Housing cost, itself related to a location's density, could loosely be considered a proxy for demand, and as demand for a location increased, its lower-income residents might be forced to move. As it decreased, its upper-income households might look to move to more affluent communities. An agent who decided to move would then scan a radius of locations and select a certain number at random. The number of locations and the move radius varied by income quintile. Given a set of possible locations, the agent would score each location according to its compatibility with his or her employment needs, population density preferences, and household income. The location with the highest score would become the move to location, and the simulation would record the agent's movement at the appropriate time step. We simulated the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic through a set of sudden mid-simulation changes to model mechanisms and object attributes. Suddenly, a higher proportion of the workforce was assigned a remote work status, and the employment-related subscore calculation responsible for selecting a move-to location was no longer applied for those who could work from home. Agents' population preferences for low-density locations were dialed up to reflect an avoidance of populous, crowded places where rates of disease transmission would be higher. We hypothesized that these changes would affect overall environment structure, facilitating an increase in lower density population locations characterized by greater income homophily, caused by the increased flow between high population and low population locations. Animated heat maps of our simulation environment over time reveal that, despite a log normal distribution of population density at initialization, agents across all income quintiles tend to congregate in high density urban centers in search of greater economic opportunity, with the lowest income quintiles concentration the most visible in a single, large, and growing contiguous area. As COVID changes agents' preferences for population density and switches off the employment location subscore function for the remote workforce, households begin to redistribute themselves away from large urban centers to middle density locations, similar to suburbs, where population density is lower than in cities, yet housing cost grows more slowly than in remote rural areas. Here you can see median income across the entire simulation environment, with locations pre-COVID income values plotted against their post-COVID analogs. Locations experiencing little change gravitated toward the x=y axis, while locations plotted at a greater distance experienced more significant change. While the absolute difference in most locations' median income pre- and post-COVID ranged from $5,000 to $7,500, variance in changes to median income were greater for low-density locations, some of which experienced changes of up to $20,000, or approximately half the range of all observed median income values. Significantly, low-capacity locations located in the bottom half of the plot beneath the x=y line were originally high-income enclaves that experienced a sudden decrease in median income as a result of the pandemic, probably facilitated by the migration to suburbs driven by sudden increases to housing cost and a change to population density preferences, which we will see in the next slide. Behind the scenes, we can observe the mechanisms at play that cause these observed changes to environmental structure. As the subscore attributable to housing cost first precipitously drops, then sharply rises at the introduction of the pandemic, the total average location score drops steeply across all quintiles and remains low thereafter, though location scores become the lowest for the lowest income quintile post-COVID, with the gap between average housing scores for the highest and lowest quintiles widening dramatically across a more or less stable spread. Presumably, the steep rise in housing cost scores affect total subscore aggregation for the lowest income quintile the most, while the comparative stability of location scores across income quintiles post-pandemic speaks again to the function of the pandemic in slowing the growth of concentrated regions of high poverty. This is clearest through the mitigation of the attractor effect, documented in the rapidly increasing average location scores for lowest quintile households pre-pandemic, an effect that drew the most impoverished agents toward that single concentrated community we saw in the earlier animations. The relative stability of the average location scores for that quintile post-COVID reflects the movement of agents out of that densely concentrated community toward the middle density suburban regions to escape escalating housing costs and high COVID transmitting population density. In the last plot, we see that the mean occupancy for many high-capacity locations drops from close to 100% to approximately 50% density. By contrast, if a location's population capacity was initialized as a mid-sized location, its occupancy increased from approximately 50% to closer to 100. The suburbs, or the mid-sized sites with around half the capacity of the highest capacity locations, became the attractors in the post-COVID landscape. So the big takeaways from our modeling research were that the pandemic facilitated migration to lower population areas as expected, but that housing cost concerns and a preference for lower density locations insulated remote rural populations from a rapid population explosion. Locations' median incomes did not change as much as we had projected, though some low-capacity locations saw a steep drop as the emigration of even a few agents from a smaller community could have an appreciable impact on area income. Changes to our agents' population density preferences and changes to housing cost, affected by the flow of agents between locations, were the two most important contributing factors to suburban flight. Finally, we noticed that our comparison of household income to a location's median income at the point of decision to move resulted in an unintended, albeit perhaps in retrospect, somewhat predictable pattern of income segregation and socioeconomic homophily in our simulation, which was somewhat exacerbated by the introduction of the pandemic, when job opportunity subscoring was switched off for many agents, leaving housing cost as the primary driver of the decision on where to move. Future applications of this research could include extension of the modeling mechanisms to observe changes to mobility dynamics resulting from the pandemic that are not related to employment or population density preference, such as the impact of the eviction moratoria and the issuance of federal prevention and mobile rehousing subsidies. We hope our model inspires continued research into the impact of COVID on issues relating to housing, income, and homelessness. Thank you.